Okay, so have you ever like found yourself in that situation where you say yes when you really wanted to say no?
Oh, yeah.
Like every fiber of your being is like, but you're like, yeah, sure, I can do that.
It's so relatable.
It's so relatable.
Yeah.
And that's what we're diving into today, this whole idea of the art of saying no. Why is it so hard?
Right.
What are the benefits? How do we actually get better at it? You know, we're looking at some insights from this mindset coach, Krishna, who talks about how like mastering saying no, it's kind of a game changer for living a joyful life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting how this topic, it seems so simple on the surface,
Right.
but it really speaks to some deep-seated dynamics.
Right.
Like we're talking societal expectations,
Yeah.
this innate human desire to please.
Totally. And it's funny because we were talking about how there's actually research behind this.
Oh, absolutely.
Like it's not just, Krishna's philosophy. There's a study in Scientific Reports that I thought was really fascinating.
Oh, yeah? Tell me about that one.
That really digs into why we find it so hard to refuse requests. Yeah.
And it turns out it's often because of social conditioning,
Wow.
not even a lack of desire.
It's like we're wired to avoid saying no.
Yeah, and it's almost like we've been programmed that way.
Right.
But Krishna's whole thing is that saying no is actually a form of self-care.
Totally.
It's not about being selfish. It's about setting those boundaries.
Yeah.
And he makes this point that every time you say no to something, you're actually saying yes to something else.
That's a great point because it's those values, those priorities, that time for yourself.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Because I know there's also a lot of research on boundary setting.
Oh, absolutely. And Krishna's approach aligns perfectly with that body of research.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that you have the right to set limits.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about making choices that are in alignment with your own needs and values.
Yeah, it's about that internal compass.
Exactly.
It's not just blindly following, like you said, societal expectations.
Right.
Okay, but here's the thing. It's easy to say all of this, right?
It's easy to say, oh, I'm just going to set boundaries and I'm going to say no more often.
It's harder to actually put it into practice.
But then you're in that moment and someone asks you to do something and you're like, oh, I don't want to let them down. Or, oh, I don't want to seem rude.
Yeah, that fear of guilt tripping someone or seeming like you're not a team player.
Yeah.
It's real.
It's so real. There's this piece in Next Big Idea Club that I thought about when we were prepping for this deep dive because they talk about how strong the desire to please is.
It makes sense, though, from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah.
We're wired for connection, right?
Yeah.
So the thought of potentially disrupting that by saying no can feel really threatening.
It can be scary. And you know what I thought was interesting about Krishna's perspective on this is he talks about how he struggled with this for years.
Oh, really?
Like he wasn't always good at saying no.
It's kind of comforting to hear that, right?
Yeah. It is. It's like, okay, this isn't something that you just like achieve overnight and then you're good to go.
It's a process.
Yeah. And it's something that he really had to work on, but he really emphasizes how essential it is for a stress-free life.
And it makes sense when you think about it because constantly saying yes, it can lead to resentment.
Oh, absolutely.
It can lead to burnout.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not good for anyone.
No, it's not good for you. It's not good for the people that you're saying yes to.
Exactly.
It's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's unsustainable.
So I want to dive into some of Krishna's advice because he gets really practical about this. And I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, let's get tactical.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So one thing he talks about is being interested, not wishy-washy. So basically, don't beat around the bush.
Be direct.
Be direct, but be respectful, obviously.
Right. It's finding that balance between
Yeah.
being assertive and being considerate.
Exactly. And there's some really interesting research on what's called refusal skills training,
Oh, tell me more about that.
where they've actually found that when people are given specific scripts for saying no,
Interesting.
they feel more empowered and they're less likely to give in to pressure.
It's like having those tools in your back pocket.
Yes, exactly. It's like having those go-to phrases so that you're not caught off guard.
Right, because when you're put on the spot, it's easy to just default to yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't have to be anything complicated, right?
Right.
Krishna believes that a simple, I can't make it, or now is not a good time, is often enough.
Yeah, there's power in brevity.
What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Because when you over-explain or you start apologizing profusely, it can actually backfire.
Oh, interesting.
It can make you seem less sure of yourself.
It's like you're trying to justify it.
Exactly.
And then you're more likely to get roped into doing it anyway.
Right. It's almost like you're inviting further negotiation.
Yeah. So this kind of ties into another point that Krishna makes, which is about setting those boundaries.
Right. Because knowing your limits is essential.
And he really believes that knowing your limits helps you say no with more confidence and less guilt.
Because it's not about being difficult. It's about honoring your own needs and capacity.
And if you are clear about what those boundaries are, you're more likely to communicate them effectively.
Absolutely.
And without feeling like you need to apologize for them.
It's about owning your no.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about those situations where you really do value the person making the request,
Right.
but you still have to say no?
Yeah.
Like, that feels extra tricky.
Yeah, it's that delicate balance, right?
Yeah.
Because you care about the person and you don't want to disappoint them,
You want to support them.
but you also have to honor your own needs.
Yeah. So how do you navigate that? Because Krishna talks about this as being the gentle part of saying no.
Right. So it's not just about blurting out a no.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the request, maybe expressing appreciation for being asked, but still holding firm in your no.
So you're not just dismissing them outright.
Exactly.
You're acknowledging their needs, even if you can't meet them at this particular time.
Precisely. And this is also where offering alternatives when possible can be helpful.
Oh, that's a good point. So, like, for example, if someone asks for your help on a project,
Yeah.
and you're completely swamped, but you still want to be supportive, maybe you could say, hey, I can't do it right now, but how about we connect next week?
Exactly. Or maybe you can recommend someone else who might be able to help.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So it's really about finding that balance between being helpful and true to your own needs.
Yeah, it's finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. And the research really does support this idea that setting clear boundaries ultimately leads to more authentic and less stressful relationships.
Which is what we all want, right?
Absolutely.
Who doesn't want less stress in their life?
Exactly. Sign me up.
But it's interesting because it's not just about, feeling less stress. There are actual tangible benefits to this.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We can dive deeper into those.
I think we should. Yeah. And it's not just about, like feeling less stressed out. There are actual benefits to like our mental health, our productivity.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not just about, feeling a little bit lighter in your step, although that's a nice bonus.
Sure.
But there are some really concrete benefits that have been studied extensively.
Like what kind of benefits are we talking about?
Well, for starters, numerous studies have linked setting boundaries to a reduction in stress levels.
Okay.
And it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
When we're constantly saying yes to everything,
Yeah.
we're essentially putting everyone else's needs before our own. And over time, that can lead to chronic stress, anxiety, burnout, you name it.
Oh, yeah. I've been there. It's not fun.
It's not pretty.
Not pretty at all.
But when we learn to say no more often and set those boundaries, we reclaim our time and energy. And that allows us to show up more fully in other areas of our lives.
It's like they always say, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
You have to prioritize your own well-being.
And here's the thing. Prioritizing self-care doesn't mean that you're becoming selfish.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're not there for other people.
Right. You're not turning into a hermit.
Exactly.
Shutting everyone out.
In fact, it often makes us more helpful to others
Okay.
because we're coming from a place of balance and well-being.
So it's almost like being more intentional with those yeses.
Exactly. When we choose to say yes authentically from a place of alignment, we can truly dedicate our energy and enthusiasm.
It's a more meaningful yes.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to talk about the productivity piece of this because Krishna also talks about how saying no can make us more productive.
Oh, absolutely.
And at first you're like, wait, what?
Seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. How does that work?
Well, think about it this way. When we're bogged down with commitments that we don't genuinely care about,
Right.
it drains our mental energy.
It's like you're constantly multitasking,
Yes.
but not in a good way
Not in a good way at all.
because you're not really giving anything your full attention.
Exactly.
Right.
We become scattered, unfocused, less effective overall.
It's like trying to juggle too many balls at once.
Exactly.
Something's got to give.
Something's got to give.
Yeah.
But when we start saying no to the things that don't align with our priorities, we create space for what truly matters.
Okay.
And that allows us to focus on tasks and projects that excite us,
Right.
which in turn leads to greater productivity and a sense of accomplishment.
It's like decluttering our commitments in the same way that we might declutter our homes, right?
I love that analogy. It's about creating that breathing room.
Yeah.
And this increased focus can then have a ripple effect, positively impacting other areas of our lives,
Okay.
including our relationships.
That's interesting because you would think that saying no more often would damage your relationships.
Right. It seems counterintuitive.
But you're saying it can actually strengthen them.
Research suggests that clear boundaries are actually the foundation for healthy, respectful relationships.
Because if you're not setting boundaries and you're just constantly saying yes when you don't want to, that leads to resentment,
Absolutely.
which is not healthy.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. And that resentment can build up over time,
Mm-hmm.
and it can lead to frustration, anger, and eventually it can really damage the relationship.
So by setting those boundaries early on, you're kind of being proactive
Exactly.
and protecting your relationships in the long run.
It's about fostering more honest and authentic communication,
Okay.
which ultimately strengthens the bond.
And this applies to all kinds of relationships, right? Not just romantic relationships.
Absolutely. Romantic relationships, friendships, work relationships, you name it.
So it's not just about saying no to your boss when they ask you to do something.
Right.
It's about how you say no.
Exactly.
So that you're still maintaining those professional boundaries.
It's about being respectful, of course.
Yeah.
But also being firm in your limits.
And that actually builds more trust.
It does.
Yeah.
Because it shows that you have self-respect.
And that you're not just going to be a pushover.
Exactly. And speaking of self-respect, we can't forget about the impact this all has on our self-esteem.
Right. Krishna talks about this, how saying no can actually boost your self-esteem.
It makes perfect sense, though, right?
Yeah.
When we assert our needs and we prioritize our well-being, it sends a powerful message to ourselves and to others that we value
So
ourselves.
we're flexing our self-worth muscles.
I love that.
Oh.
And just like any muscle,
Yeah.
the more we exercise it, the stronger it becomes.
Okay, so we're not just talking about, saying no to a dinner invitation or taking on an extra project at work.
Right.
This is bigger than that.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah.
It's about a fundamental shift in how we approach our lives and how we interact with the world around us.
It's about recognizing our own worth and setting those boundaries so that we can show up as our best selves.
Exactly. And the research really does show that this can have a ripple effect, positively impacting not just our well-being, but our relationships, our productivity, our sense of self.
So knowing all of this, how do we actually start putting these ideas into practice? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's like we've been talking about this whole idea of like shifting your mindset and really like changing your approach to things.
It is a process, right? It's not like you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm a master of saying no.
Exactly. It's like anything else. You have to kind of like practice it and get better at it over time.
Absolutely. And it starts with self-compassion.
Okay.
Being kind to yourself throughout this journey, because you're not always going to get it right.
Yeah.
There are going to be times when you fall back into old patterns, and that's totally fine.
It's not about being perfect.
It's not about perfection at all.
It's about progress.
Exactly. And celebrating those small victories along the way.
Which, kind of reminds me of what Krishna was saying about like those little wins.
Oh, yeah.
Like every time you do set a boundary, every time you do say no, like acknowledge that. Absolutely. Give yourself credit for it.
Don't just brush it off.
Right, because those small wins really do add up over time.
And I imagine the more you do it, the easier it gets.
Exactly. It's like you're retraining your inner voice, right?
Yeah, it's like silencing that inner critic that's like, oh, but I have to say yes.
Exactly. And over time, that voice of self-doubt, it starts to quiet down. And the voice of self-assurance, it gets louder.
It's like you're kind of rewiring your brain to prioritize your well-being.
Precisely. And eventually it becomes more automatic.
That's awesome.
You'll start to notice those situations where maybe you would have automatically said yes in the past, but now you're able to pause, take a breath, and really check in with yourself.
And it's not coming from a place of guilt or like you have to over-explain yourself.
Exactly. It's about owning your no.
Wow. This has been such an insightful deep dive.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you about it.
Yeah, I feel like I've learned so much, and I hope our listeners have too.
Me too. And if there's one thing I want listeners to take away from this conversation, it's this. The next time you're about to say yes out of habit or obligation, pause for a moment and ask yourself, is this truly a yes? Or am I just afraid to say no?
That's such a powerful question.
It really is. Because it helps you connect with your own needs and desires.
It's about honoring yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for others is to simply say no.
I love that. Well, on that note, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. It's been amazing exploring the research and the insights behind saying no, and how it's not about being selfish, but about creating a more authentic and fulfilling life.
Absolutely. It's about living on your own terms.
Yes, exactly. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained some valuable tools and perspectives today. And remember, be kind to yourself, practice those no muscles, and embrace the power of setting boundaries. Until next time.